Tonight we travel back in time to a world that once existed and now only whispers. The Viking Age did not begin with conquest, nor did it end with defeat. It emerged from a landscape that offered little security and demanded constant adaptation, where survival depended less on ideals than on endurance, and where human life was shaped by forces that could neither be negotiated with nor fully understood. This was a world defined by cold seasons, limited resources, and long periods of uncertainty, in which communities existed at the edge of sustainability and where failure carried immediate consequences. In such conditions, belief was not a matter of comfort, but a framework for explaining risk, loss, and inevitability, while social structures developed not to promote freedom, but to prevent collapse. The people later known as Vikings did not see themselves as adventurers or raiders in the modern sense. They understood their lives as bound to obligation, reputation, and fate, moving within systems that regulated violence, loyalty, and survival with remarkable consistency. Their actions, whether peaceful or destructive, followed patterns shaped by environment, tradition, and belief rather than impulse or spectacle. This story does not seek to romanticize the Viking Age, nor does it reduce it to brutality alone. Instead, it examines the mental and social structures that allowed people to endure a world governed by scarcity, uncertainty, and the constant presence of death. Through climate, belief, law, ritual, and fear, the Viking Age reveals itself not as an era of chaos, but as a system designed to function under extreme conditions. What follows is a slow and deliberate journey through that system. It traces how individuals were shaped from birth, how decisions were guided by signs and expectations, how violence was controlled rather than unleashed, and how belief attempted to impose meaning on forces that could not be mastered. This is not a tale of heroes or legends. It is an examination of survival in a world that offered no guarantees, where the future was uncertain and the past was always watching. The Viking Age emerged from a region where stability was never assumed, and where survival depended on an ongoing negotiation with an unforgiving environment. Scandinavia offered neither predictable abundance nor natural protection, and the people who lived there developed their social structures, beliefs, and expectations in response to conditions that left little room for complacency. The climate of the north imposed strict limits on agriculture and settlement. Long winters reduced the growing season to a narrow window, while cold temperatures and variable weather patterns increased the risk of crop failure, livestock loss, and isolation. Communities depended on careful planning, preservation, and cooperation, knowing that a single failed harvest could place an entire household at risk. Geography intensified these pressures. Much of Scandinavia consisted of rocky soil, dense forests, and fragmented coastlines, which restricted large-scale farming and forced populations to rely on a combination of agriculture, hunting, fishing, and trade. This diversity of subsistence was not a choice driven by opportunity, but a necessity imposed by limitation. Isolation was a recurring condition. During winter months, travel became dangerous or impossible, and communities could remain cut off for extended period. In such circumstances, self-sufficiency was essential, and reliance on distant authority or external assistance was neither practical nor expected. Scarcity shaped social expectations. Resources such as food, land, and tools were finite, and competition for them was unavoidable. This reality encouraged systems that emphasized obligation, reciprocity, and reputation, as individuals depended on their standing within the community for support during periods of hardship. Failure carried immediate consequences. Unlike societies with surplus reserves or centralized redistribution, early Scandinavian communities could not easily absorb prolonged disruption. illness, injury, or miscalculation threatened not only individuals, but entire households, reinforcing the importance of shared labor and mutual accountability. Children grew up observing these conditions as normal. From an early age, they learned that security was temporary and that survival required contribution rather than expectation. Work was introduced gradually, not as discipline, but as preparation for a life in which dependency carried risk. The absence of guaranteed safety influenced how danger was perceived. Risk was neither avoided nor sought unnecessarily, but accepted as an inherent feature of existence. This acceptance shaped attitudes toward labor, travel, and conflict, fostering a practical relationship with uncertainty rather than denial or fear. Natural forces were understood as powerful and indifferent. Storms, cold, and seasonal change were not interpreted as anomalies, but as predictable expressions of a world that did not adjust itself to human needs. This perception encouraged respect rather than optimism, and caution rather than confidence. Settlement patterns reflected these realities. Homes were constructed to provide insulation and durability, often clustered in ways that balanced cooperation with independence. The longhouse became both a physical shelter and a social structure, accommodating extended families, shared labor, and collective responsibility. Food storage was a constant concern. Preservation methods such as drying, smoking, and fermenting were essential for bridging periods when fresh resources were unavailable. The success of these methods depended on experience and discipline, and mistakes could not easily be corrected. Livestock management further reflected the limits imposed by climate. Animals represented both wealth and vulnerability, requiring protection during winter and sufficient fodder to survive until spring. Decisions about slaughter and preservation involved careful calculation, balancing immediate needs against future uncertainty. Trade offered opportunities to supplement local resources, but it also introduced new risks. Travel exposed individuals to weather, navigation hazards, and unfamiliar territories, while exchange depended on trust and reputation rather than enforceable contract. Despite these dangers, trade remained essential as it allowed access to materials and goods unavailable locally. The combination of isolation and exposure created a worldview in which stability was understood as temporary. Prosperity could be achieved, but it could also be lost, sometimes without warning or clear cause. This understanding discouraged complacency and reinforced the importance of preparation and vigilance. Conflict was an extension of this environment. Disputes over land, resources, and honor emerged within communities that had limited mechanisms for external mediation. As a result, systems evolved to regulate violence, aiming to contain it rather than eliminate it. These systems did not seek to create safety in an absolute sense. Instead, they aimed to manage risk in a way that allowed communities to function despite persistent threat. Order was valued not as an ideal, but as a practical necessity. The absence of guaranteed protection influenced how people interpreted success and failure. Outcomes were not always attributed to individual skill or effort, as uncontrollable factors played a visible role in daily life. This perception opened space for belief systems that addressed uncertainty without promising control. In this context, the idea that the world did not promise safety was neither pessimistic nor fatalistic. It was descriptive. Acknowledging risk allowed individuals and communities to prepare for it, rather than being surprised by it. The Viking Age cannot be understood without recognizing this foundational condition. Before ships crossed seas or raids reached foreign shores, people learned to endure a world that demanded resilience and offered little reassurance. Everything that followed, including belief, law, and expansion, developed within this framework of accepted uncertainty. In the Viking Age, human life was understood as unfolding within boundaries that existed before conscious choice could take shape. Birth did not represent a beginning free of constraint, but an entry into a structure governed by lineage, reputation, and expectations that preceded the individual and would continue long after their death. The concept of fate occupied a central position in this worldview. Rather than being perceived as a distant abstraction, fate was understood as an active force shaping outcomes regardless of intention, effort, or moral reasoning. This belief did not eliminate responsibility, but it reframed it, placing individual action within a broader framework that could not be fully influenced or predicted. From early childhood, individuals were socialized into this understanding. Names, family associations, and inherited obligations connected a person to previous generations, binding their identity to actions taken long before they were born. Honor and shame were not personal achievements alone, but collective conditions carried by households and kinship networks. Lineage mattered because it provided continuity in a world defined by uncertainty. Knowing where one belonged offered a form of stability, even when material conditions remained precarious. At the same time, lineage imposed expectations that could not easily be escaped, as reputation shaped access to alliances, protection, and opportunity. Fate was often articulated through the figures of the Norns, who were believed to shape the course of human lives. These entities were not moral judges in the later Christian sense, nor did they reward virtue or punish wrongdoing consistently. Instead, they represented inevitability, reinforcing the idea that outcomes were shaped by forces beyond human negotiation. This belief influenced how success and failure were interpreted. Prosperity did not necessarily indicate favor, nor did misfortune imply wrongdoing. Both were understood as expressions of a larger pattern that could be endured, but not fully controlled. Importantly, belief in fate did not encourage passivity. On the contrary, action remained essential, as refusing to act carried its own risk. The difference lay in motivation, as effort was directed toward fulfilling obligation rather than guaranteeing outcome. Social roles were assigned early. Children observed the responsibilities of adults and learned through participation rather than instruction, absorbing expectations that defined their future positions within the community. Deviation from these roles was possible, but it required negotiation with both family and reputation, making radical departure uncommon. The acceptance of fate provided psychological coherence. In a world where illness, accident, and environmental disaster could disrupt life without warning, the belief that events followed an underlying order reduced the burden of uncertainty. Loss could be endured not because it was justified, but because it was expected. This perspective shaped attitudes toward risk. Danger was acknowledged rather than denied, and individuals learned to live with the possibility of sudden change. Courage was valued not because it ensured survival, but because it demonstrated acceptance of inevitability. Family structures reinforced this worldview. Marriage alliances, inheritance practices, and obligations between kin functioned to distribute risk across networks rather than isolate it within individuals. Responsibility was shared, and failure was rarely experienced alone. Fate also influenced conflict resolution. When disputes arose, outcomes were not always interpreted as reflections of justice, but as results shaped by circumstance and timing. This did not remove accountability, but it limited expectations of perfect resolution. The belief that fate preceded choice affected how ambition was perceived. Striving beyond one's position was not inherently condemned, but it carried the risk of disrupting balance within the community. Ambition required caution, as success could provoke tension just as easily as failure. This worldview created a distinctive relationship between freedom and constraint. Individuals exercised agency within recognized limits, accepting that certain outcomes lay beyond influence while others depended on effort and cooperation. The boundary between these domains was not always clear, but it was consistently acknowledged. Stories and oral tradition reinforced these ideas. Narratives emphasized inevitability, consequence, and endurance rather than redemption or transformation. Listeners were reminded that even the most capable figures could not escape the patterns governing existence. Death further reinforced belief in fate. The timing and manner of death were understood as expressions of forces already in motion, rather than events that could always be avoided through caution or virtue. This acceptance reduced fear, but it did not eliminate grief. Grief itself followed structured expectations. Expressions of loss acknowledged both personal pain and the continuity of the group, reinforcing the idea that individuals passed through a system that endured beyond them. Fate framed loss as part of an ongoing cycle rather than an isolated tragedy. The belief that life's course was shaped before conscious choice emerged did not negate responsibility. Instead, it defined responsibility differently, emphasizing fulfillment of role over pursuit of outcome. Honor lay in acting appropriately within circumstance, not in controlling consequence. This perspective shaped the moral landscape of the Viking Age. Actions were evaluated based on alignment with expectation and obligation rather than adherence to universal principles. Right and wrong were contextual, rooted in relationship and consequence rather than abstract ideals. Understanding this framework is essential for interpreting later development. Belief, law, violence, and expansion all unfolded within a worldview that accepted inevitability while demanding participation. The Viking Age was not driven by the illusion of control, but by the necessity of acting within limits that could never be fully escaped. Childhood in the Viking Age was not defined by protection from hardship, but by gradual exposure to it. From an early age, children were integrated into the rhythms of daily labor and responsibility, learning through observation and participation rather than instruction or abstraction. There was little separation between the world of adults and the world of the young. Households functioned as collective units, and every member, regardless of age, contributed according to ability. This integration ensured that children understood the demands of survival long before they were expected to meet them independently. Play and work were not rigidly distinguished. Tasks such as gathering firewood, tending animals, or assisting with food preparation were introduced gradually, allowing skills to develop alongside physical strength. Mistakes carried consequences, not as punishment, but as lessons reinforced by necessity. Education occurred through imitation. Children watched adults manage tools, negotiate disputes, and respond to risk, absorbing patterns of behavior that defined acceptable conduct within the community. Knowledge was practical, transmitted through repetition rather than formal explanation. Physical endurance was cultivated naturally. Exposure to cold, uneven terrain, and long periods of activity strengthened resilience, while discomfort was accepted as a normal condition rather than something to be avoided. This acceptance reduced sensitivity to hardship and prepared individuals for environments that offered little relief. Emotional restraint was also learned early. Expressions of fear or distress were acknowledged, but not indulged, as excessive reaction could compromise group stability. Children learned to manage emotion within limits defined by necessity rather than expectation. Gender roles began to take shape during childhood. Boys and girls observed different responsibilities modeled by adults, internalizing expectations that would later structure their participation in labor, family life, and authority. These roles were not entirely rigid, but deviation required justification and acceptance by the community. Training for adult responsibilities was continuous. Skills related to farming, fishing, craftsmanship, and household management were reinforced through repeated involvement, ensuring competence before independence became unavoidable. Competence was valued not for personal achievement, but for its contribution to collective survival. Conflict resolution was also learned through observation. Children witnessed disputes and their outcomes, gaining an understanding of acceptable behavior, negotiation, and consequence. Violence was neither hidden nor glorified, but treated as a regulated response rather than an impulsive act. Risk was introduced gradually. Whether through travel, tool use, or interaction with animals, children learned to assess danger through experience rather than avoidance. This approach fostered familiarity with uncertainty and reduced hesitation in later life. Family reputation influenced childhood experience. Children inherited not only resources, but also expectations shaped by the actions of previous generations. Honor and shame affected access to opportunity and protection, reinforcing awareness of behavior beyond the individual level. Discipline was pragmatic. Correction aimed to restore function rather than assert authority, and punishment reflected concern for outcome rather than moral judgment. The objective was reliability, not obedience for its own sake. Physical strength was developed alongside skill. Daily labor provided conditioning, while seasonal demands required sustained effort over long period. Endurance was valued as much as capability, as fatigue could threaten survival as effectively as ignorance. Storytelling reinforced lessons learned through experience. Narratives emphasized consequence, endurance, and limitation, presenting models of behavior shaped by environment and obligation rather than idealized heroism. Children absorbed these narratives as guidance rather than entertainment. Social boundaries were reinforced early. Understanding one's position within kinship networks and local hierarchy provided clarity in a world where ambiguity could create conflict. Belonging offered protection, while isolation increased vulnerability. Loss was encountered early. Illness, accident, and environmental hardship affected families unpredictably, introducing children to grief as an unavoidable aspect of existence. These experiences reinforced the acceptance of impermanence rather than denial of it. Preparation for adulthood was continuous rather than formalized. There was no singular transition marking maturity, but a gradual accumulation of responsibility acknowledged by the community. Recognition followed demonstrated reliability rather than age alone. Failure during youth carried long-term implications. Reputation developed early and influenced future trust, emphasizing the importance of consistency even in formative years. Forgiveness was possible, but memory persisted. The absence of protection from hardship shaped character. Individuals emerged from childhood accustomed to effort, uncertainty, and shared responsibility, qualities necessary for functioning within a demanding environment. Mercy was not absent, but it was expressed through inclusion rather than exemption. Growing up in the Viking Age required adaptation rather than idealism. Childhood prepared individuals for participation in a system that valued contribution, resilience, and awareness of consequence. The skills and expectations learned during these years formed the foundation upon which belief, law, and violence would later operate. Religion in the Viking Age did not function as a source of moral reassurance or unconditional protection. The gods were understood as powerful forces whose favor could be sought, but never assumed, and whose intervention could bring benefit or disaster with equal indifference. Unlike later religious systems that emphasized consistency and moral clarity, the Norse gods occupied a world defined by uncertainty and limitation. They were neither omnipotent nor immune to fate, and their actions reflected the same instability that governed human existence. This parallel reinforced the perception that divine powers did not offer escape from risk, but mirrored it. Odin exemplified this dynamic. He was associated with wisdom, knowledge, and foresight, yet his pursuit of understanding was marked by sacrifice, deception, and ambiguity. Those who sought his favor did so knowing that insight often came at a cost, and that guidance could lead toward danger rather than safety. Thor represented strength and protection, but his role was limited. He defended the world against threats, yet he did not prevent hardship, nor did his power guarantee prosperity or survival. Reliance on Thor acknowledged resistance rather than assurance, reinforcing the belief that struggle was unavoidable. Other deities embodied similarly complex qualities. Frey was associated with fertility and abundance, yet harvest success remained uncertain, and offerings did not ensure predictable outcomes. Freya was linked to love, fertility, and death, illustrating the inseparability of creation and loss within the divine framework. The gods were not bound by human concepts of justice. They could reward loyalty and still allow suffering, or punish transgression without offering explanation. This unpredictability discouraged complacency and reinforced the necessity of continued ritual engagement rather than trust. Worship was transactional rather than devotional in the later sense. Offerings, vows, and sacrifices represented attempts to negotiate favorable conditions, not expressions of unconditional faith. Success was interpreted as temporary alignment rather than permanent favor. Failure of divine support did not invalidate belief. Instead, it reinforced the understanding that even correct ritual action could not override broader forces. This perspective allowed belief to persist despite misfortune, as disappointment was expected rather than shocking. Sacred spaces reflected this relationship. Rather than centralized temples, worship often occurred at local sites connected to landscape features such as groves, stones, or water sources. These locations emphasized proximity and immediacy rather than separation between divine and human realms. Priestly authority was informal and situational. Individuals who led rituals did so based on lineage, reputation, or circumstance rather than institutional appointment. This flexibility reflected the decentralized nature of belief and reinforced the idea that divine favor was not monopolized. Mythological narratives reinforced caution. Stories depicted gods who deceived one another, failed to prevent catastrophe, and were themselves subject to destruction. Listeners learned that even divine power had limits and that reliance on any force carried inherent risk. The concept of Ragnarok exemplified this worldview. Rather than promising eternal stability, it acknowledged inevitable collapse, including the death of gods themselves. This narrative normalized the expectation of loss and reinforced acceptance of impermanence. Divine betrayal was not framed as malice. It reflected alignment with a world governed by forces beyond loyalty or intention. The gods did not exist to protect humanity from fate, but to participate within it. This understanding influenced personal decision-making. Individuals sought divine guidance while recognizing its limitations, balancing ritual action with practical preparation. Faith did not replace responsibility, but existed alongside it. Signs and omens were interpreted cautiously. Divine messages were ambiguous, requiring interpretation rather than obedience. Misreading signs carried consequences, reinforcing the need for experience and judgment. The gods demanded respect, but not moral purity. Transgression did not always result in punishment, nor did virtue guarantee reward. This moral ambiguity aligned divine behavior with the unpredictability of human life. Religious practice reinforced social cohesion. Shared rituals acknowledged collective vulnerability and created moments of alignment, even if outcomes remained uncertain. Participation mattered more than belief certainty. Divine relationships were renewed continuously. There was no assumption of lasting favor, only ongoing negotiation. This dynamic discouraged dependency and reinforced vigilance. The absence of guaranteed divine protection shaped emotional resilience. Disappointment did not destroy belief, because belief was never based on certainty. Instead, it provided a framework for enduring unpredictability. Fear was not eliminated through worship. It was acknowledged and managed through ritual, narrative, and expectation. The gods offered explanation rather than escape. Understanding the gods as capable of betrayal did not weaken their authority. It strengthened realism, aligning belief with lived experience rather than idealized expectation. This alignment made religious systems durable under stress. The relationship between humans and gods in the Viking Age was therefore defined by caution rather than trust. Divine power was respected, sought, and feared, but never relied upon as a guarantee. Survival required acknowledgement that even the gods could not always be depended upon. This belief shaped ritual behavior, moral judgment, and emotional endurance. It prepared individuals to face loss without interpreting it as abandonment or failure. In a world where betrayal by circumstance was common, divine betrayal was neither shocking nor destabilizing. The gods reflected the world as it was experienced rather than as it was desired. They embodied power constrained by inevitability, reinforcing acceptance of limits rather than promises of salvation. Within this framework, belief functioned as preparation, not protection. Ritual practice in the Viking Age was not oriented toward celebration or spiritual comfort, but toward the management of uncertainty. Rituals existed as practical responses to a world in which outcomes were rarely predictable and in which human effort alone could not account for success or failure. The purpose of ritual was preventative rather than redemptive. Communities engaged in repeated ceremonial actions not to correct moral failure, but to reduce the likelihood of disaster in environments where misfortune was expected rather than exceptional. Central to these practices was the blot, a communal sacrificial rite intended to establish alignment between humans, gods, and the forces governing nature. The blot was not a singular or uniform event, but a category of rituals adapted to local needs, seasonal cycles, and specific concerns such as harvest success, health, or protection during travel. Sacrifice functioned as an act of exchange. Offerings of animals, food, or valuable goods were made with the understanding that reciprocity was possible, but never guaranteed. The act itself mattered more than the result, as participation acknowledged vulnerability and reinforced collective responsibility. Animals chosen for sacrifice were selected based on availability, symbolic association, and circumstance. Their value lay not only in their physical worth, but in the cost represented by their removal from daily use. Sacrifice therefore carried tangible risk, reinforcing the seriousness of the ritual act. Blood held particular significance within these ceremonies. It was used to mark objects, people, or spaces, symbolically binding them to the ritual intent. This practice emphasized physical connection rather than abstract belief, grounding ritual in material reality. Ritual timing reflected seasonal rhythms. Ceremonies often coincided with transitions such as the onset of winter, the beginning of the agricultural cycle, or preparations for travel. These moments represented heightened vulnerability, making ritual intervention both logical and necessary. Participation was communal rather than individual. Rituals brought households and kinship groups together, reinforcing social cohesion at moments when collective survival was most at risk. Absence from ritual could be interpreted as withdrawal from shared responsibility rather than personal disbelief. Leadership within ritual contexts was situational. Those who directed ceremonies did so based on reputation, lineage, or perceived competence rather than formal religious office. Authority was temporary and dependent on outcome rather than position. Rituals were also constrained by taboo. Certain actions, words, or behaviors were avoided during specific periods, reflecting concern that violation could invite misfortune. Taboos reinforced discipline and attentiveness, encouraging caution during times of heightened risk. Everyday behavior was shaped by these restrictions. Decisions regarding travel, labor, or conflict could be postponed or altered based on perceived ritual contamination or unfavorable signs. This flexibility reflected respect for uncertainty rather than superstition alone. Ritual failure was an accepted possibility. When disaster followed proper observance, it did not invalidate the ritual system, but reaffirmed the belief that forces beyond human influence remained active. Rituals mitigated risk, but they did not eliminate it. Memory played a role in shaping ritual practice. Communities remembered which actions preceded prosperity or loss, adjusting behavior accordingly without assuming absolute causation. Experience informed repetition rather than dogma. Ritual space was often integrated into the natural environment. Groves, stones, and water sources functioned as focal points, reinforcing the idea that sacred forces permeated everyday landscape. This integration reduced separation between ritual and daily life. Objects associated with ritual acquired significance through use rather than inherent sanctity. Tools, vessels, or structures became meaningful through repeated participation in ceremonial action. Their power derived from continuity rather than symbolism alone. Ritual language emphasized intention rather than doctrine. Spoken formulas acknowledged uncertainty, sought alignment, and recognized limitation without asserting control. Precision of action mattered more than belief certainty. Children observed ritual from an early age. Their inclusion reinforced continuity and ensured transmission of practice through participation rather than instruction. Ritual knowledge was experiential, absorbed through repetition. Ritual also served to manage fear. By providing structured responses to uncontrollable events, ceremonies reduced paralysis and offered psychological orientation. Fear was acknowledged, not denied, and given form through action. Failure to observe ritual could provoke anxiety. Omission raised concern that misfortune might result from negligence rather than inevitability. This pressure encouraged adherence even among the doubtful. The cumulative effect of ritual practice was stabilization. Even when outcomes remained uncertain, shared action reinforced social bonds and provided continuity in times of stress. Ritual sustained cohesion rather than certainty. In this way, ritual functioned as a system for managing disaster rather than preventing it outright. It acknowledged human limitation while offering structured engagement with forces beyond control. Through repetition, sacrifice, and restraint, communities sought endurance rather than protection. Understanding ritual as a response to vulnerability clarifies its central role in Viking society. It was neither blind superstition nor abstract spirituality, but a practical framework for facing a world defined by risk. Within this framework, survival depended on participation rather than belief, and continuity mattered more than outcome. Violence in the Viking Age was not understood as uncontrolled aggression, but as a regulated response to conflict within a constrained environment. It emerged from the same conditions that shaped law, belief, and social obligation, functioning as a tool to restore balance rather than as an expression of chaos. Communities recognized that disputes were unavoidable. Scarcity, competition for land, and the importance of reputation created circumstances in which conflict could escalate quickly if left unmanaged. Violence therefore existed within a framework intended to limit its spread and prevent long-term destabilization. Honor played a central role in this system. Insults, breaches of agreement, or acts perceived as disrespectful threatened not only individuals, but entire kinship networks. Failure to respond could weaken standing within the community, increasing vulnerability to future challenges. At the same time, unrestrained retaliation was discouraged. Excessive violence risked triggering cycles of revenge that could overwhelm local structures and endanger collective survival. As a result, responses were expected to align with established expectations regarding proportionality and timing. Legal customs provided alternatives to immediate violence. Compensation, arbitration, and negotiated settlement offered means of resolving disputes without bloodshed, preserving relationships when possible. These mechanisms did not eliminate violence, but they shaped when and how it was considered acceptable. When violence did occur, it was often preceded by warning or ritual acknowledgement. Challenges, declarations, or symbolic actions signaled intent, allowing others to prepare or intervene. This transparency reduced the likelihood of surprise attacks within the community and reinforced shared norms. Weapons carried social meaning. They represented both capability and responsibility, marking individuals as potential agents of force whose actions would be scrutinized. Ownership implied readiness to defend reputation, but also obligation to exercise restraint. Feuds illustrate the regulated nature of violence. While long-running conflicts did occur, they followed patterns governed by expectation, negotiation, and periodic attempts at resolution. Even extended hostility operated within limits shaped by kinship ties and communal pressure. Public assemblies played a role in containing violence. Disputes brought before gatherings allowed grievances to be aired and judgments to be rendered, reducing the need for immediate retaliation. Although outcomes were not always accepted, the process itself reinforced order. Violence against outsiders followed different conventions. Interactions with groups beyond established social networks lacked shared norms, increasing the likelihood of aggressive action. In these contexts, violence could serve as deterrence, acquisition, or assertion of power rather than restoration of balance. Even so, violence toward outsiders was rarely random. Targets were chosen strategically, and actions reflected calculation rather than impulse. Success depended on coordination, timing, and assessment of risk. The threat of violence functioned as a form of communication. Demonstrations of strength or readiness signaled boundaries and discouraged encroachment. This implicit understanding reduced the need for constant confrontation. Social memory reinforced regulation. Communities remembered acts of violence and their consequences, shaping future expectations. Individuals known for excessive brutality could face isolation or retaliation, while those who acted within accepted limits maintained standing. Violence was also constrained by practical considerations. loss of able-bodied members weakened households and reduced capacity for survival. As a result, lethal force was weighed against its long-term impact. Ritual and belief influenced perceptions of violence. Certain actions were believed to carry spiritual consequence, reinforcing caution in how force was applied. Violence that disrupted cosmic or social order was feared as much as it was effective. Training in violence occurred through observation rather than formal instruction. Young individuals learned acceptable conduct by witnessing both restraint and escalation, internalizing limits alongside capability. This learning process emphasized control rather than ferocity. The presence of rules did not eliminate brutality. In moments of breakdown or desperation, violence could exceed accepted bounds, leaving lasting scars. Such episodes reinforced awareness of why regulation was necessary. Importantly, violence was never celebrated as an end in itself. Its value lay in effectiveness, deterrence, and restoration of balance rather than expression of dominance. Glory narratives emphasized consequence and endurance rather than excess. This regulated approach shaped expansion beyond Scandinavia. Raids and conflicts abroad applied familiar principles of calculation and restraint, even in unfamiliar environments. Violence remained a means, not a defining identity. Understanding violence as rule-bound clarifies its role within Viking society. It functioned as a controlled mechanism within a broader system of survival, belief, and law. Without these constraints, communities risked collapse under the weight of unchecked conflict. The expansion of the Viking Age beyond Scandinavia was not driven by impulse alone, but by a technological and environmental convergence that made sustained movement across water both possible and necessary. Central to this transformation was the longship, a vessel designed not only for speed and flexibility, but for survival in conditions that offered little margin for error. The longship emerged from generations of maritime experience. Coastal living had long required navigation among fjords, islands, and open stretches of water, fostering familiarity with currents, winds, and shoreline behavior. This accumulated knowledge informed design choices that prioritized adaptability over specialization. Construction reflected practical constraint. Longships were built with overlapping planks secured in a manner that allowed the hull to flex under stress rather than fracture. This flexibility absorbed wave impact and reduced structural failure, increasing the likelihood of survival during rough conditions. Shallow draft defined their strategic value. The ability to navigate rivers, approach beaches directly, and retreat quickly expanded the range of accessible environments. Ports were unnecessary, and coastal defenses designed for deeper vessels offered limited protection. The sail represented a critical development. While rowing provided control, sail power extended range and reduced physical exhaustion during long journeys. Mastery of sail handling required coordination and experience, reinforcing collective discipline aboard the vessel. Crews operated as interdependent units. Every individual aboard a longship contributed to navigation, propulsion, and maintenance, and failure by one could endanger all. This enforced cooperation extended social expectations beyond land-based communities. Navigation relied on environmental awareness rather than instrument. Sailors interpreted wave patterns, cloud formations, bird movement, and coastline features to maintain orientation. These methods demanded attentiveness and experience, reinforcing the role of memory and observation. Open water presented constant risk. Storms could arise without warning, visibility could disappear, and currents could alter course beyond correction. Unlike land travel, retreat was often impossible once conditions deteriorated. The sea was not perceived as an adversary to be conquered. It was understood as a force that could not be controlled, only respected and navigated. Survival depended on timing, restraint, and acceptance of limitation. Voyages were therefore calculated rather than reckless. Departure times reflected seasonal knowledge, while routes favored familiarity over novelty when possible. Risk was accepted, but unnecessary exposure was avoided. Despite caution, loss was common. Ships failed, crews vanished, and outcomes were often unknown to those left behind. The absence of certainty reinforced the perception that travel across open water represented a gamble shaped by fate as much as skill. The psychological impact of the sea was significant. Extended exposure to isolation, monotony, and vulnerability tested emotional endurance. Confidence relied on shared expectation rather than reassurance. Leadership aboard ship was situational. Authority rested with individuals whose experience inspired trust, but decisions required collective compliance. Failure of judgment carried immediate and visible consequences. Preparation extended beyond the vessel itself. Food, water, and repair materials were limited by capacity, forcing careful selection and rationing. Shortages at sea could not be remedied easily. Arrival in unfamiliar territory did not guarantee safety. Coastlines could conceal hostile environments, unpredictable tides, or inaccessible terrain. Successful landfall required assessment as deliberate as departure. The longship facilitated speed and surprise. Its ability to approach and withdraw rapidly altered the dynamics of contact with coastal communities. This capability amplified psychological impact without requiring numerical superiority. However, reliance on the ship also imposed vulnerability. Damage, grounding, or capture could leave crews stranded far from support. Protection of the vessel became a priority equal to personal survival. Maintenance was continuous. Hull integrity, sail condition, and equipment required constant attention, both at sea and on land. Neglect increased risk exponentially. The ship functioned as both tool and boundary. It enabled expansion while limiting options, binding crews to a narrow margin between success and disaster. This constraint reinforced discipline and mutual reliance. Belief intersected with maritime experience. Voyages were often accompanied by ritual observance intended to secure favorable conditions. These actions acknowledged vulnerability rather than asserting control. Loss at sea was interpreted within existing frameworks of fate. Disappearance did not always demand explanation, as the sea was understood to take without justification. Grief acknowledged absence rather than certainty. The expansion enabled by longships altered social possibility. Contact with distant regions introduced new resources, conflicts, and opportunities that reshaped local economies. These changes were cumulative rather than immediate. The open sea therefore functioned as both pathway and filter. Those who survived repeated voyages demonstrated adaptability, coordination, and endurance. Failure removed individuals from participation entirely. Over time, maritime experience influenced identity. Familiarity with risk, exposure, and uncertainty reinforced values already present in land-based life. The sea did not create these traits, but intensified them. The longship symbolized this convergence. It represented the application of restraint, knowledge, and collective effort to environments that resisted control. Its success depended on acceptance of limitation rather than denial of danger. Expansion across water did not signal confidence in domination. It reflected willingness to act despite uncertainty, guided by preparation rather than assurance. This mindset defined the movement of the Viking Age beyond its geographic origins. The sea offered access, but never safety. Every voyage reaffirmed the understanding that survival depended on alignment between skill, timing, and forces beyond influence. Within this balance, the longship carried both possibility and loss. Long before Viking ships appeared on the horizon, fear often arrived first. It moved through rumor, memory, and anticipation, shaping behavior in regions that had not yet experienced direct contact. The psychological reach of the Viking Age extended beyond physical presence, altering decisions and perceptions before any confrontation occurred. Communities along exposed coastlines lived with awareness of vulnerability. The sea connected distant regions, but it also erased distance, allowing unfamiliar forces to appear without warning. This uncertainty transformed the shoreline into a zone of constant attention rather than security. News traveled unevenly but persistently. Stories of raids, destruction, and disappearance circulated through traders, travelers, and displaced survivors. Details were often incomplete, exaggerated, or distorted, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Fear did not depend on accuracy. It relied on plausibility, and the idea that danger could emerge suddenly from the sea was sufficient to alter behavior. Communities adjusted routines, reinforced boundaries, and reconsidered exposure based on expectation rather than confirmation. The absence of visible threat intensified anxiety. Unlike land-based conflict, maritime danger could not be observed until it was already present. This lack of early warning undermined confidence in existing defenses and planning. Religious institutions were particularly affected. Monasteries and churches located near waterways embodied wealth, stability, and visibility, making them both symbols and target. Their vulnerability disrupted assumptions about protection afforded by sanctity or isolation. Fear altered patterns of settlement. Some communities relocated inland, while others attempted to fortify existing positions despite limited resources. These responses reflected adaptation to perceived threat rather than certainty of attack. Preparation often conflicted with necessity. Coastal access supported trade and subsistence, but it also increased exposure. Decisions involved balancing immediate survival against long-term risk, with no option offering complete security. The reputation of Viking raiders amplified this tension. Accounts emphasize speed, unpredictability, and decisiveness, portraying attackers as forces rather than individuals. This abstraction intensified fear by removing the possibility of negotiation or familiarity. Communities that had not yet experienced direct violence still adapted their behavior. Vigilance increased, watches were organized, and warnings were established despite uncertainty. Fear functioned as a catalyst for collective action even in the absence of immediate threat. The psychological burden of anticipation was significant. Extended periods of alertness strained social cohesion, as resources and attention were diverted toward defense. Fatigue and anxiety became persistent features of daily life. Religious interpretation framed these fears. Some understood approaching danger as punishment, while others viewed it as a test of faith or endurance. These explanations provided meaning, but they did not eliminate uncertainty. Fear also influenced diplomacy. Rulers and leaders adjusted alliances, payments, and concessions in response to perceived threat, sometimes preemptively. The possibility of violence reshaped political decisions before any conflict occurred. The unpredictability of Viking movement intensified this effect. Targets could not reliably anticipate timing or location, undermining confidence in strategic planning. This uncertainty allowed fear to function as an extension of power. Memory reinforced expectation. Once a region experienced attack, the experience became part of local narrative, shaping response for generations. Even long periods of calm did not fully erase anticipation of return. Fear influenced how people interpreted ordinary events. Unfamiliar sails, changes in weather, or distant movement could trigger alarm. This heightened sensitivity reflected the psychological impact of perceived threat rather than irrationality. The effect extended beyond material preparation. Fear altered posture, attention, and social interaction, embedding itself in everyday behavior. It became a background condition rather than a temporary reaction. For the Vikings themselves, fear was a deliberate component of strategy. Reputation amplified effectiveness, reducing resistance and increasing success without requiring constant engagement. Psychological impact functioned as a multiplier of limited resources. This dynamic blurred the boundary between presence and absence. Viking influence extended into regions they had never entered, shaping response through expectation alone. Fear traveled faster than ships. Understanding this psychological dimension is essential for interpreting the Viking Age. Expansion was not defined solely by physical movement, but by the spread of anticipation and adjustment. The presence of fear reshaped societies before any encounter took place. The arrival of ships marked culmination rather than beginning. By the time sails appeared on the horizon, communities had already been altered by expectation. Fear had prepared the ground. In the Viking Age, law did not exist to create justice in an abstract sense, but to prevent societies from collapsing under the weight of unresolved conflict. Legal systems emerged as practical responses to environments where violence, retaliation, and competition could otherwise spiral beyond control. Order was not idealized, but maintained because disorder carried immediate and collective consequences. The absence of centralized authority shaped the development of legal customs. Without permanent enforcement institutions, communities relied on shared expectations, reputation, and collective participation to uphold decisions. Law functioned only as long as individuals believed that adherence served survival better than defiance. At the center of this system stood the Thing, a public assembly where disputes were addressed and decisions formalized. Attendance was not optional, as absence could weaken legitimacy and invite further conflict. The Thing represented a space where tension was contained through structure rather than suppressed through force. Participation in the Thing reinforced accountability. Disputes were aired openly, witnesses were heard, and outcomes were shaped by precedent rather than personal dominance. Public process limited escalation by transforming private grievances into collective responsibility. Legal authority was distributed rather than centralized. Law speakers memorized and recited legal codes, ensuring continuity across generations without written record. Their role emphasized preservation rather than innovation, reinforcing stability in a changing environment. Judgment relied on consensus rather than command. Outcomes reflected negotiation among parties rather than absolute rulings imposed from above. This approach reduced resentment by acknowledging competing interests rather than denying them. Compensation served as a primary mechanism for resolving violence. Payments acknowledged harm without requiring perpetual retaliation, allowing communities to restore balance while preserving relationship. Refusal to accept compensation carried social cost, as it signaled unwillingness to reintegrate. Law regulated violence by providing alternatives. While lethal force was not prohibited, it was constrained by expectation regarding justification, timing, and consequence. Illegal violence threatened not only individuals, but the credibility of the system itself. Reputation functioned as enforcement. Individuals known to disregard legal outcomes risked isolation, reduced alliance, and vulnerability. Social memory ensured that defiance carried lasting consequence. Law also structured hierarchy. Status influenced legal standing, but it did not exempt individuals from accountability. Power was recognized, yet constrained by communal scrutiny. Women participated indirectly within legal processes. Their interests were represented through kinship networks, and their testimony could influence outcomes depending on circumstance. Law acknowledged social reality rather than formal equality. The system depended on shared belief in consequence. Without enforcement force, compliance rested on expectation that deviation would provoke collective response. Fear of isolation proved as effective as fear of punishment. Legal failure carried risk. When disputes exceeded the capacity of the system, violence could resurface unchecked. These breakdowns reinforced awareness of law's necessity rather than its weakness. Law was adaptive. Customs evolved in response to changing conditions, including expansion, trade, and external influence. Continuity existed alongside adjustment. The presence of law distinguished regulated violence from chaos. It provided predictability in outcomes even when fairness could not be guaranteed. Predictability mattered more than justice in environments defined by risk. Legal assemblies reinforced communal identity. Shared participation affirmed belonging and responsibility beyond individual interests. Law became a collective act rather than an imposed rule. Conflict resolution through law reduced long-term instability. Although disputes persisted, their management prevented perpetual escalation. This containment allowed communities to endure rather than fracture. The law did not eliminate fear. It redirected it, transforming anxiety about violence into caution about consequence. This shift supported continuity under stress. Understanding law as a survival mechanism clarifies its central role. It represented the final barrier between structured conflict and uncontrolled collapse. Without it, the pressures shaping the Viking Age would have become unmanageable. Power in the Viking Age was not limited to visible authority or public violence, and much of it operated within domestic and ritual spaces that shaped daily survival. Women occupied positions of influence that rarely appeared in formal narratives, yet their roles were essential to continuity, stability, and decision-making within households and communities. This power was exercised quietly, but it was neither marginal nor symbolic. The household functioned as the primary economic and social unit. While men were often absent due to travel, trade, or conflict, women managed resources, labor, and internal order. These responsibilities required authority rather than assistance, as failure could threaten the survival of the entire household. Control over food production and storage placed women at the center of subsistence management. Decisions regarding preservation, distribution, and consumption shaped resilience during periods of scarcity. Such choices involved long-term calculation rather than immediate need. Women also oversaw domestic labor network. They coordinated the work of children, relatives, and dependents, maintaining productivity during seasonal fluctuations and male absence. This coordination required negotiation, enforcement, and judgment. Legal and social authority extended into marriage arrangements. women participated in alliance formation through marriage, influencing relationships between families and clans. These unions were strategic rather than romantic, and women's consent and cooperation affected their success. Property rights reflected this authority. Women could inherit, own, and manage property, particularly in the absence of male relatives. This control reinforced autonomy within defined social boundaries. Divorce was possible and regulated. Women could initiate separation under specific conditions, reclaiming property and returning to kin networks. This option provided leverage rather than equality, but it offered protection against certain forms of abuse or instability. Influence extended beyond the household into ritual contexts. Women participated in and sometimes led ceremonial practices related to fertility, protection, and divination. These roles connected domestic authority with spiritual influence. Seeresses occupied a distinct position. They were consulted during periods of uncertainty, conflict, or transition, offering interpretations rather than command. Their authority derived from perceived access to knowledge beyond ordinary experience. This ritual influence was both respected and feared. Seeresses operated at the boundary between social order and the unknown, and their presence signaled moments of heightened risk. Their words carried weight precisely because they could not be easily verified or challenged. Women's influence also shaped reputation. Through speech, memory, and judgment, they contributed to narratives of honor and shame that affected male behavior. Reputation was maintained not only through action, but through collective memory. Emotional regulation within households often fell to women. They mediated conflict, managed grief, and maintained cohesion during periods of stress. This labor was invisible but critical. Violence intersected with female authority in indirect ways. While women rarely engaged directly in combat, their approval, encouragement, or restraint influenced male decisions. Silence could function as consent or condemnation. Women also preserved continuity across generations. They transmitted knowledge related to household management, ritual practice, and social expectation through observation and participation. This transmission ensured stability despite external disruption. Status affected the extent of influence. Elite women possessed greater access to resources and networks, but even women of modest means exercised authority within constrained domains. Power was relative, but it was present across social levels. The absence of formal recognition did not diminish effectiveness. Women's authority operated within accepted norms rather than against them, reducing resistance. This integration allowed influence to persist without challenge. Narratives that focus solely on warfare obscure this dimension. Survival depended as much on internal stability as on external action. Women maintained that stability through continuous, adaptive labor. Their power was not revolutionary. It did not seek to overturn hierarchy, but to function within it. This pragmatism ensured durability. Understanding the Viking Age requires recognition of this silent authority. Without it, expansion, conflict, and belief systems would have lacked foundation. Women carried power not through spectacle, but through necessity. Death in the Viking Age was not approached as an abstract inevitability, but as a condition that could be anticipated, prepared for, and, to some extent, managed. Rather than being excluded from daily consideration, death remained present in decision-making related to labor, travel, conflict, and belief. Its proximity shaped behavior long before it arrived. High mortality rates reinforced this awareness. Illness, injury, childbirth, and environmental exposure reduced life expectancy and made loss a common experience rather than an exceptional one. Communities adapted by integrating death into social and economic planning. Preparation for death began early. Individuals accumulated possessions not only for use in life, but with awareness that these items might accompany them in burial. Weapons, tools, and personal objects functioned as markers of identity extending beyond death. Burial practices reflected status, belief, and calculation. The resources invested in a grave signaled social position and reinforced memory among the living. At the same time, excessive expenditure risked depriving the household of essential goods. This balance required judgment. Families weighed the honor conferred by elaborate burial against the material needs of those who remained. Death demanded respect, but survival demanded restraint. The location of burial carried significance. Graves placed near settlements or prominent landscapes maintained connection between the living and the dead. These sites reinforced continuity rather than separation. Belief in an afterlife influenced preparation. Valhalla, hell, and other conceptions of posthumous existence framed expectations about what awaited the dead. These beliefs did not eliminate fear, but they contextualized it. Importantly, the afterlife was not guaranteed. Entry depended on circumstance, reputation, and manner of death rather than moral purity. This uncertainty encouraged calculation rather than comfort. Violent death carried distinct meaning. Death in battle was associated with honor and potential reward, but it also represented loss of labor and protection for the household. Glory and cost were inseparable. Non-violent death was equally significant. Illness or accident did not imply failure or disgrace, but it required the same practical response. Communities adapted by redistributing responsibility and property. Inheritance practices reflected anticipation of death. Property transfer was regulated to maintain stability and prevent conflict. Clear expectation reduced disruption following loss. Memory management formed part of death calculation. Stories, markers, and ritual ensured that individuals were remembered in ways that supported family reputation. Forgetting carried social consequence. Death influenced risk assessment. Individuals accepted danger when potential gain justified exposure, but reckless loss threatened collective survival. Courage was respected, but waste was criticized. Ritual acknowledgement accompanied death. Ceremonies structured grief and reinforced continuity, preventing emotional collapse from undermining function. Grief was expressed, but it was also contained. Children observed these processes closely. Early exposure normalized death as part of existence rather than an aberration. This familiarity reduced paralysis and promoted acceptance. Death was also political. The loss of leaders or key figures altered power dynamics and required negotiation. Succession planning reduced instability. Travel and expansion intensified death calculation. Journeys carried increased risk, and absence often ended without confirmation. Uncertainty demanded flexible response. The sea amplified this reality. Loss at sea often left no body, no grave, and no closure. Communities adapted through ritual acknowledgement rather than certainty. Death did not end obligation. The dead continued to influence behavior through memory, expectation, and belief. This continuity shaped decision-making among the living. Calculating death did not remove its weight. It structured response rather than emotion. Preparation allowed endurance without denial. The Viking Age treated death as a factor to be integrated rather than avoided. Acknowledgement replaced illusion, and calculation replaced surprise. Within this framework, survival depended on facing mortality without expectation of mercy. In the Viking Age, death did not mark a complete separation between the living and the dead. Those who died were believed to retain influence, awareness, and presence, continuing to shape behavior long after burial. The boundary between life and death was therefore understood as permeable rather than absolute. Graves were not hidden or removed from daily life. They were often placed near settlements, roads, or prominent landscape features, ensuring that the dead remained visible within the living world. This proximity reinforced continuity rather than absence. Burial mounds functioned as markers of memory and authority. Their presence signaled lineage, ownership, and continuity across generations. To pass a grave was to be reminded of those who had shaped the land before. The dead were not perceived as passive. They were believed capable of influencing fortune, health, and outcome, particularly if neglected or disrespected. This belief encouraged ongoing acknowledgement rather than closure. Care for burial sites reflected this relationship. Maintenance of graves, offerings, and respectful conduct served to preserve alignment between the living and the dead. Neglect risked disruption rather than indifference. Stories reinforced fear of the restless dead. Accounts of Draugr and other revenant figures described the dead who returned not as moral punishers, but as disturbances within the natural order. These narratives emphasized containment rather than redemption. The fear associated with such figures reflected concern over imbalance. A disturbed dead person represented a failure in ritual, respect, or social obligation. Corrective action focused on restoration rather than punishment. Burial practices incorporated preventative measures. Positioning of bodies, placement of objects, and sealing of graves aimed to ensure stability. These actions were not symbolic alone, but practical expressions of belief. The dead also functioned as witnesses. Ancestral presence reinforced social norms, as actions were understood to be observed beyond immediate community. Shame and honor extended across generations. Memory of the dead influenced decision-making. Choices regarding land use, alliance, and conflict considered ancestral expectation alongside present necessity. Continuity carried weight equal to innovation. Inheritance practices reflected this awareness. Property was not simply transferred, but passed along lines that preserved ancestral connection. Disruption of these patterns risked social instability. The dead played a role in legitimizing authority. Claims to leadership often referenced lineage and ancestral precedent rather than individual merit alone. The past validated the present. Ritual interaction with the dead was cautious. Communication was sought through structured practice rather than casual engagement. Boundaries were acknowledged even as they were approached. Seasonal observances reinforced remembrance. Certain times of year heightened awareness of ancestral presence, aligning agricultural cycles with memory. These periods emphasized continuity rather than loss. Fear of the dead was balanced by reliance on them. Ancestors were invoked for protection, legitimacy, and guidance, despite their potential to unsettle. This duality reflected acceptance of risk inherent in all relationship. The landscape itself became layered with presence. Hills, fields, and coastlines carried associations with those buried nearby. Movement through space involved navigation of memory as well as terrain. Christian observers later struggled to interpret this worldview. The integration of the dead into daily life conflicted with emerging doctrines emphasizing separation. Tension emerged not only over belief, but over the meaning of presence. Despite changing religious influence, ancestral memory persisted. Practices adapted, but the expectation that the dead remained aware did not disappear immediately. Continuity outlasted conversion. The dead also influenced emotional endurance. Loss was mitigated by belief in continued presence, allowing grief to coexist with function. Absence was acknowledged without finality. This worldview discouraged disregard for consequence. Actions carried weight beyond the individual lifespan, shaping how risk and ambition were approached. The future was accountable to the past. Violence against burial sites was considered severe. Disturbing graves disrupted social and spiritual balance, provoking fear rather than conquest. Such acts challenged continuity itself. The presence of the dead reinforced caution. Behavior was shaped not only by living judgment, but by imagined ancestral response. This awareness regulated conduct without visible enforcement. Understanding the role of the dead clarifies Viking belief systems. Life, death, and memory formed a continuous framework rather than separate states. This integration shaped identity, authority, and resilience. The dead were not silent. They watched through memory, place, and expectation, influencing decisions long after breath had ceased. Their presence anchored the living within an unbroken chain. The decline of the old gods did not begin with rejection, but with strain. Their authority weakened not because belief vanished, but because the world that sustained that belief was changing in ways the old framework struggled to explain. What followed was not a sudden conversion, but a prolonged period of uncertainty in which faith became increasingly difficult to reconcile with experience. Contact with the Christian world introduced alternative explanations for suffering, order, and authority. These ideas did not immediately replace existing beliefs, but they created comparison, and comparison introduced doubt. The presence of another system exposed the limits of the old one. Christianity offered a God who claimed moral consistency and universal authority. Unlike the Norse gods, this deity promised order beyond circumstance and justice beyond negotiation. For societies accustomed to unpredictability, this promise carried appeal, even if acceptance remained cautious. The old gods had never promised protection. They demanded ritual, respect, and sacrifice without guaranteeing outcome. As external pressures increased, this transactional uncertainty became harder to justify. Political change accelerated this tension. Emerging kingship required centralized authority and standardized loyalty, structures better supported by a unified religious framework. The decentralized nature of Norse belief conflicted with the demands of expanding power. Conversion often began at the top. Rulers adopted Christianity not only for spiritual reasons, but to legitimize authority, secure alliances, and align with dominant powers. This strategic adoption filtered downward unevenly. For many communities, the shift was pragmatic rather than ideological. Christian rituals were incorporated alongside existing practices, creating periods of overlap rather than replacement. Belief adapted before it surrendered. The failure of old rituals contributed to erosion. When sacrifices and observances no longer aligned with success, explanations weakened. Repeated misfortune strained confidence in practices that had once provided coherence. This strain did not immediately destroy faith. Instead, it altered emphasis, shifting belief toward tradition rather than expectation. The gods remained present, but their influence felt diminished. Christianity reframed suffering. Where Norse belief accepted misfortune as inevitable, Christian doctrine offered meaning through endurance and redemption. This reinterpretation appealed to societies experiencing increasing instability. Ritual landscapes changed gradually. Sacred groves lost prominence, while churches introduced fixed points of worship. The movement from natural sites to constructed spaces altered how the sacred was experienced. Resistance persisted. Many continued to honor the old gods privately, even as public practice shifted. Conversion was often layered rather than absolute. Generational difference intensified transition. Younger members exposed to Christian teaching adapted more readily, while older generations retained established frameworks. Belief fractured along lines of experience rather than conviction. Christian law altered moral interpretation. Actions once evaluated by consequence and obligation were reframed through concepts of sin and guilt. This shift disrupted established social logic. The old gods began to feel distant. Their myths no longer aligned with emerging political and social realities. Stories that once explained the world now felt anchored to a fading order. Christian literacy reinforced dominance. Written doctrine stabilized belief, while oral tradition struggled to maintain consistency across expanding territories. The permanence of text replaced the flexibility of memory. Economic integration strengthened conversion. Trade networks favored alignment with Christian regions, incentivizing participation. Faith became intertwined with access and opportunity. The old gods did not disappear quietly. They persisted in story, custom, and memory, even as formal worship declined. Their presence lingered beyond institutional abandonment. Christianization reframed fear. Where Norse belief emphasized acceptance of fate, Christian doctrine introduced judgment. This altered emotional orientation toward the future. Death gained new meaning. The afterlife became moralized rather than situational, reshaping motivation and behavior. This transformation affected how individuals assessed risk. Violence required reinterpretation. Actions once justified through honor faced moral scrutiny. This tension destabilized traditional systems of legitimacy. The decline of the old gods was uneven. Some regions adapted quickly, others resisted for generations. Belief fractured geographically as well as socially. The shift altered identity. Being Viking no longer required adherence to ancestral gods. Cultural continuity separated from religious practice. Mythological memory survived conversion. Stories were preserved as heritage rather than belief, transforming gods into symbols. Meaning shifted without vanishing. Christianity offered certainty, but not comfort. New moral expectations introduced anxiety alongside hope. The cost of clarity replaced the burden of ambiguity. Old rituals lost public legitimacy. Participation declined as social pressure increased. Private observance became increasingly isolated. The collapse of the old belief system was gradual. It occurred through accumulation rather than event. Faith eroded as coherence weakened. What failed was not belief itself, but its explanatory power. The gods no longer accounted for a world reshaped by political, economic, and ideological forces. Their authority diminished as relevance faded. This failure left a vacuum. Communities adjusted unevenly, negotiating identity amid competing frameworks. Stability required replacement, not absence. the transition marked a psychological rupture. A worldview centered on acceptance gave way to one emphasizing judgment and redemption. This altered how individuals perceived responsibility. The Viking Age entered its final phase here. Not through conquest or defeat, but through internal transformation. The old gods failed because the world that sustained them no longer existed. The end of the Viking Age did not arrive through sudden destruction, invasion, or decisive defeat. It unfolded gradually, as the assumptions that had once organized life lost coherence and no longer provided reliable guidance. What collapsed was not a people, but a way of interpreting the world. For centuries, Viking society had been structured around acceptance of uncertainty. Belief, law, violence, and kinship functioned together as a system designed to endure instability rather than eliminate it. As conditions changed, this system struggled to adapt without losing internal consistency. Central authority expanded. Kingship introduced expectations of obedience that extended beyond kinship networks, replacing negotiated obligation with centralized command. This shift altered the balance between autonomy and order that had previously defined social life. Law became increasingly codified. Written systems replaced oral memory, fixing rules that had once adapted fluidly to circumstance. Stability increased, but flexibility diminished. Christian morality reshaped judgment. Actions were evaluated less by consequence and obligation, and more by adherence to universal standards. This reframing disrupted established notions of honor and responsibility. Violence lost legitimacy as a regulated social tool. What had once functioned as controlled response now appeared as disorder requiring suppression. Authority increasingly claimed monopoly over force. Trade networks expanded and standardized. Economic survival became less dependent on local adaptation and more on participation in broader systems. Interdependence replaced isolation. With this shift came new vulnerabilities. Failure in distant regions could now affect local stability, reducing the effectiveness of traditional self-sufficiency. The world grew larger, but less predictable in new ways. Social roles became more rigid. Opportunities once shaped by reputation and circumstance were increasingly defined by legal status and inheritance. Mobility narrowed as systems formalized. The meaning of fate changed. Acceptance of inevitability gave way to concepts of moral accountability and judgment. Responsibility expanded, but psychological burden increased. Ritual practice lost centrality. Ceremonies that had once structured communal response to uncertainty were replaced by standardized worship. Participation became symbolic rather than practical. Ancestral presence faded. Graves remained, but their influence weakened as identity detached from lineage. The past receded from daily consideration. Memory shifted form. Oral tradition yielded to written record, preserving information while reducing adaptability. Stories became history rather than guidance. The sea changed meaning. Once a frontier demanding skill and acceptance, it became a regulated route within expanding systems of control. Risk was managed institutionally rather than personally. Expansion no longer defined identity. Movement became migration or trade rather than exploration shaped by uncertainty. The ethos of endurance lost relevance. Communities adjusted unevenly. Some adapted quickly, others resisted or withdrew. Cultural continuity fractured across regions. The collapse was therefore uneven and incomplete. Elements of the old worldview persisted within new frameworks, stripped of original context. Survival required compromise rather than preservation. What disappeared was not strength or capability. It was the coherence of a system built for a world defined by isolation and uncertainty. As that world vanished, so did the logic that sustained it. The Viking Age ended not with silence, but with transformation. People continued, adapted, and endured, carrying fragments of older meaning into new structures. Identity shifted without disappearing. This slow collapse reshaped perception of self. Individuals became subjects rather than participants in negotiated order. Security increased, but agency narrowed. Fear changed form. Rather than anticipating natural unpredictability, anxiety focused on moral failure and judgment. The burden of responsibility replaced acceptance of fate. The old balance between limitation and endurance dissolved. What remained was a world seeking control rather than accommodation. This pursuit defined the emerging medieval order. The Viking Age did not vanish. It was absorbed, reshaped, and reinterpreted within systems that no longer required its logic. Memory persisted, but function did not. The collapse was therefore quiet. No single moment marked the end, only gradual loss of relevance. A worldview faded as another took its place. Understanding this process reveals the true conclusion of the Viking Age. Not an ending imposed from outside, but an internal transformation driven by change. The world moved on, and the old framework could not follow. To reflect on the Viking Age is not to ask what these people believed, but to examine the conditions under which belief itself became necessary. The world they inhabited did not invite hope in the modern sense, nor did it encourage confidence in progress or protection, but instead required continuous adjustment to forces that operated independently of human intention. Survival within this environment depended on the ability to accept limitation without surrendering agency, and to act without assurance that effort would be rewarded. This acceptance shaped every aspect of life. Climate, scarcity, illness, and violence were not understood as disruptions of an otherwise stable order, but as expressions of a reality that offered no guarantees. The Viking Age was therefore not defined by optimism or despair, but by endurance, a sustained willingness to function within conditions that could not be negotiated. Modern perspectives often frame survival as a problem to be solved. In contrast, the Viking worldview treated survival as an ongoing condition rather than an objective, acknowledging that risk could be managed but never removed. This distinction is critical, as it explains why preparation replaced expectation, and why belief systems focused on alignment rather than control. Fate, as understood in this context, was not resignation. It was recognition that outcomes emerged from a convergence of forces beyond individual command, including environment, lineage, timing, and collective action. To acknowledge fate was not to abandon effort, but to situate effort within boundaries that could not be crossed. This perspective altered the meaning of responsibility. Rather than being measured by outcome, responsibility was assessed through participation, adherence to role, and acceptance of consequence. Failure did not always imply fault, and success did not always indicate merit, but both demanded response. Law, belief, and ritual functioned as tools for navigating this uncertainty. They did not promise justice, safety, or reward, but offered structure where unpredictability threatened cohesion. Their purpose was containment rather than resolution, allowing communities to persist without requiring certainty. Violence, when it occurred, followed similar logic. It was not celebrated as expression, but tolerated as necessity, constrained by expectation and memory. Unchecked violence threatened collective survival, and restraint was therefore valued as much as strength. Death occupied a central position within this framework. It was anticipated rather than denied, integrated into planning rather than isolated as aberration. Preparation for death did not remove its weight, but it reduced shock, allowing continuity to persist despite loss. The presence of the dead reinforced this continuity. Memory, lineage, and ancestral expectation extended responsibility beyond individual lifespan, anchoring behavior within a broader temporal frame. Actions were taken not only for immediate benefit, but with awareness of how they would be remembered. Children were raised within this reality. From an early age, they learned that security was temporary and that contribution was required for belonging. Protection existed, but it was conditional, expressed through inclusion in responsibility rather than exemption from hardship. Women exercised authority within these conditions quietly but decisively. Their influence sustained households, mediated conflict, and preserved continuity in the absence of spectacle. Power functioned through necessity rather than visibility. Expansion across sea reflected acceptance of uncertainty rather than confidence in domination. Voyages were undertaken with awareness of loss as a possible outcome, and success was measured by survival rather than conquest alone. The willingness to act without assurance defined movement as much as ambition. Fear operated as a constant presence. It was neither eliminated nor indulged, but acknowledged and managed through preparation, ritual, and expectation. Fear became a condition rather than a crisis, shaping vigilance without paralyzing action. This worldview stands in contrast to modern assumptions. Contemporary societies often rely on systems designed to reduce exposure to risk, externalize responsibility, and promise protection. The Viking Age offers an example of life organized around acceptance rather than avoidance. Such acceptance did not imply indifference. Suffering was felt, loss was mourned, and fear was experienced, but these responses occurred within a framework that emphasized endurance over resolution. Emotion was acknowledged without being allowed to disrupt function. When the old worldview began to collapse, it was not because it was false, but because the conditions that sustained it had changed. Centralized authority, written law, and moralized religion introduced new expectations incompatible with a system built for isolation and unpredictability. Acceptance of fate gave way to demands for control and judgment. This transformation altered the relationship between individuals and uncertainty. Where unpredictability had once been accepted, it became framed as failure or moral deficiency. The burden of responsibility increased as tolerance for ambiguity declined. Looking back, the Viking Age challenges modern conceptions of resilience. Resilience here did not mean recovery to a prior state, but persistence within instability. It required adjustment rather than resistance, and participation rather than expectation. To ask whether one would have survived such a world is therefore not a question of strength or courage alone. It is a question of whether one could function without assurance, act without guarantee, and accept loss without expecting explanation. Survival depended on alignment with reality rather than belief in exception. Modern identity often rests on the assumption that systems will intervene. In the Viking Age, intervention was uncertain, and responsibility remained localized. Communities depended on themselves rather than abstraction. This reliance shaped moral expectation. Right action was defined by contribution and restraint rather than universal principle. Meaning emerged from function rather than ideal. The endurance of this system over centuries suggests its effectiveness within its context. It did not produce comfort, but it produced continuity. It did not eliminate fear, but it rendered fear manageable. To survive such a world required relinquishing the desire for certainty. It required acceptance that effort might fail, belief might disappoint, and preparation might not suffice. Yet action remained necessary regardless. This paradox defined existence. To act without assurance, and to endure without expectation of reward. The Viking Age resolved this paradox through participation rather than explanation. Its people did not ask whether the world was fair. They asked whether life could be endured within it. Meaning was constructed through continued engagement rather than justification. What remains for the modern observer is not admiration or condemnation. It is recognition of an alternative relationship with uncertainty, one that prioritizes endurance over optimism and responsibility over reassurance. This relationship is unfamiliar, but it is coherent. The question therefore remains open, not as judgment, but as reflection. Removed from modern protections, guarantees, and systems of intervention, would adaptation replace expectation? Would responsibility be accepted without promise of rescue? Would preparation persist even when success was uncertain? Would belief function without assurance? Would endurance replace hope? This is not a question of heroism. It is a question of alignment with reality as it is experienced rather than as it is desired. The Viking Age demanded such alignment without negotiation. Would you have survived in a world ruled by fate? Would you have survived in this era?